Many Christians aren't prepared to answer the objections to their faith. But what if there was a podcast dedicated to equipping Christians with answers to engage the culture? That's exactly what Dean's Dialogue is dedicated to doing. And today I'll be talking with apologist and philosopher Dr. Tim McGrew about the historical reliability of Acts. Let's move to external evidence. When we talk about external evidence, what do we mean by external evidence, and how does that play out in the book of Acts?
So external evidence has to do with connections between something that we read in a book of, in this case, the book of Acts, and sources outside of the Bible. Especially, it's interesting to see how non-Christian sources or sources that are just sheerly, archaeological, help us to see points of detail where we can check on the accuracy of the author. And starting in Acts chapter 13, the missionary journeys of Paul, the book of Acts intersects what we know about the Greco-Roman world in just numerous ways. We can check up in literally over 100 points of detail. And when we do, we have an opportunity to judge how accurate Luke is as a historian. One of my colleagues here at Western Michigan University, recently retired, was professor of ancient history here for 50 years. At his retirement party, this is Paul Meyer, and at his retirement party, the joke was that he wasn't the professor of ancient history, he was the ancient professor of history. And he wrote a novel about Pontius Pilate. Somebody said, "A novel? He knew the guy!" But Paul Meyer sat across from me one day in our cafeteria here and looked me straight in the eye and said, "Luke is the most accurate ancient historian I have ever read."
Oh, wow.
And now I have done my own homework and am in a position to say Paul Meyer was right. So this is the kind of thing that's done best by example. So let me give you just a few categories of examples of cases where we can check up on what Luke says.
Okay.
And he gets it right. So Paul's traveling. And as Luke is narrating the travels, we get a chance to hear about overland routes and cities and landmarks and political boundaries. So in Acts 14, we find that we get the proper location of Iconium. Which of the provinces is Iconium in? Is it in Phrygia, or is it in Lycaonia? Well, it's in Phrygia, and that's documented in Acts 14:6. We get the correct order of approach of certain cities. If you're coming from the Cilician Gates, you would come to Derbe, then to Lystra. So you get Acts 15:41, Acts 16:1. That's in the correct order. The description of Philippi as a Roman colony in Acts 16, and its seaport is Neapolis. This is attested both in manuscripts and in what we call numismatic evidence. It's stamped on coins. There's the right location of a small river near Philippi in Acts 16:13. The proper location of two cities, Amphipolis and Apollonia, that are about 30 miles apart. That's about the distance that travelers would make and spend successive nights on the journey to Thessalonica. Acts 17:1 gives us the proper locations of those cities. We can confirm that archaeologically. You have to remember, this is a world without Google.
That's true.
You can't sit down and look up the Wikipedia article on Asia Minor and figure it out and then weave that into your historical novel.
Mm-hmm.
These are hard things to get right if you're guessing at it. This is something much easier to get right if you're intimately acquainted with people who actually made the journey, or if you were, as is, I think, the case from Acts 16 onward, largely, if you were actually on the journey with them.
Mm-hmm.
Acts 13 gives a natural crossing between two ports, which are named correctly. Mount Cassius is within sight of Cyprus. So that's Acts 13:4 and 5. A ship crossing from Cyprus would go to Perga. That's the proper port, Acts 13:13. The proper port that returning travelers would use would be Atalia. It's a coasting port, so you'd go to pick up a coasting vessel. By contrast with Perga, Perga is a river port, so depends on what kind of a port you're looking for. These are correctly named in the proper ways.
We could literally go on like the rest of the day.
Absolutely, and I'm not even fully launched, but you probably want to go somewhere else, so that's fine.
I'm with you. So let me once again put on the skeptic's hat
Yeah.
and ask you a question. So we've got these interlockings between Acts and Paul. We have these external evidences that have been shown to be true about places and cities and ports and gates and things like that. But the skeptic will come back and say, well, that has absolutely nothing to do, and maybe I'm straw manning a little bit, but the skeptic might say, well, what in the world does that have to do with uh, Peter healing anybody, with Paul healing anybody, or any other miracle claim or supposed miracle documentation in the Book of Acts? Is that relevant? What you've talked about so far, is that relevant to these things, or are these things just separate issues when we talk about the Book of Acts?
Sure, it's relevant. Relevance does not always have to come in the form of an ironclad proof, right? You're asking the question about the veracity of an author. Is he telling us the truth? Now, there are two ways for what he tells us to be false. One of those ways is he knows that it's false and he's saying it anyway. The other way is he doesn't know that it's false. He's a dupe. Luke is someone not easily duped. Wherever we can check on the things he reports, we discover, wow, his accuracy is phenomenal. He's got all these details. Okay, I didn't even get going. You cut me off before I could give you 100 details. I'm so wounded. But this is somebody who is definitely giving us a report, and he's close up to people who were participants of it. Probably from 16 onward, he's for most of that an actual traveling companion. He begins to use the first person plural. We did this, we did that, where he hasn't used it before. Many scholars, and I think quite rightly, not just because of the we, but because of the details in the narratives, think that from that point on, for most of the time, he was a companion of Paul through to the end of the book of Acts. So this is somebody who is an eyewitness. This is a guy who's hard. It's hard to say he's just fabricating. He's just writing a novel. He doesn't really think that these things are true himself. So that limits the possible ways for this to go wrong.
Okay.
This is somebody who does not show any looseness in his handling of historical material. This is a guy who sticks pretty close to the facts, who's not just spinning a good yarn. Historical accuracy is a major theme of his. It's a concern of his. It's something he does well. And we have to take that seriously when we're looking at the question, all right, so now we have some things we can't check up on. Are they also true? Well, prima facie, this is a careful author who's close up to the facts and habitually truthful. So if you want to say he's wrong here, you got a pretty limited number of ways to get him wrong.
That's true.
It's not going to be easy to say, oh, well, he didn't really know these people. No, actually, it kind of looks like he had really good sources of information. Now, you can still maintain, without logical inconsistency, that he just got it wrong. That you can always do that. But I can do that about anything, right? We never walked on the moon. Elvis ain't dead. You can do that about anything if you're willing to just dig in and be skeptical no matter what the evidence says. But if you're sensitive to evidence, the very least that should happen is that this should worry you. Here you've got somebody who seems sober, really well-informed, credible, and he's telling you things you don't want to believe. Well, what you going to do, right? That's your credence has to change somewhat in the face of the overwhelming evidence, the mountain of evidence that Luke is an accurate historical reporter of these things close to these facts.
If you're a truth seeker, then this is gonna, cause you some pause and say, okay, at every place that I check, Luke's got it right. So let's make the conclusion or the inference or however you want to phrase it, that when I see something about Peter, and I see something about Paul, and I see something about the early church, odds are he's got it right.
Or at least I have here a significant, non-trivial reason to believe that he's got it right. And I'm going to need equally good or better reasons on the other side if I'm going to dismiss it.
Okay. Well, let's transition to something else that I wanted to ask you. You've done really good in providing some really new information to me, and I know also to the audience. But I want to dig a little bit deeper, with regards to you. What's the strongest case against Acts, or maybe let me phrase it this way: is there anything in Acts and its interlockings with Paul's writings that really makes you worry? What's the strongest case against the historical reliability of Acts, and how do you respond to that?
I don't think there is a good case against it, but Bart Ehrman has tried on his blog. He's got a place where he's tried to do this, to object to Paul's conversion. We have 3 accounts of Paul's conversion in the book of Acts. One of these is in Acts chapter 9. It's written in the narrator's voice. It's narrated as this happened to Paul. In Acts chapter 22, we have Paul's making his own defense and talking about his conversion on the stairway above an angry mob at the temple, from which he's just been whisked away by some Roman soldiers. He turns around and he addresses the angry mob. In Acts 26, we have another account of his conversion, and that's an account that he's giving in his defense before Festus and Agrippa. And Ehrman says, there are these contradictions. Acts 9 versus Acts 22. Do Paul's companions hear anything? Acts 9 versus Acts 26. Are Paul's companions knocked down or are they standing? Acts 9 and Acts 22 together versus Acts 26. Is Paul instructed by Ananias or not? And Ehrman says Luke is more interested in telling a gripping story than he is in being consistent. His artistic license has undercut his historical accuracy. I don't think any of these objections will hold up under even just a moderately close reading of the actual texts. So take Paul's conversion in chapter 9 of Acts. We read, "The men who were traveling with him stood speechless, hearing the voice, but seeing no one." And then in Acts 22:9, "Now those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me." Can we translate the Greek there as "they did not understand"? Well, let's see. Every modern translation does so. The NIV says "did not understand." The ESV says "did not understand." The NASB has "did not understand." The Net Bible has "did not understand." But the King James Version says "did not hear." Oh, well, so it could bear either meaning. Ehrman makes a decision as to which meaning he wants it to bear. Is it hearing or is it hearing with understanding? My wife said something to me today, and I heard that she was talking, but I was in the bathroom, I was brushing my teeth, I couldn't hear her, in the sense of hearing what she was trying to say. I heard that she was trying to say something. Clearly, this verb from akuo does mean to understand, even when we translate it to hear. So Luke 6:27, again, same author, right? Luke and Acts. "But I say to you who hear," obviously there it means you who understand. So this is a question about interpretation, not, as Bart wants to represent it, a question just about the plain meaning of the text. And Bart plays games like this all the time. When he tries to put Acts 9 up against Acts 26, the question is, are his companions standing or knocked to the ground? In Acts 9:7, we read that they stood speechless. Acts 26 talks about it and says, "when we had all fallen to the ground." Stood speechless means they were stopped dead. It doesn't mean that they were standing up on their feet. It's just his editorial voice paraphrasing the story he had heard. It may not even mean that he thought they were on their feet. If it does, not a big deal. So if you wanted me to, I could go to American history and I could give you much wider variations in the way that things are told regarding things that we have multiple reporters, professional reporters who were on the scene and rushed out to file their reports immediately about it, and we get much wider variations.
So just by way of comparison, so that we have something to compare to Ehrman's claim with regards to Acts, let's go ahead and, if you would, just go through one of those in American history so that the audience kind of has a comparison between what Ehrman is talking about and a more recent comparison.
Sure. So in 1927, President Calvin Coolidge notified newspapers that he would make an announcement. So all the major newspapers sent reporters. They came into his office and they filed past him. He handed each of them a typewritten slip of paper that indicated that he did not choose to run for office again. Whole process took about 1 minute. These are professional reporters. They're experienced observers. They're primed to pay particular attention. They went out at once. They filed their reports with their respective newspapers. Okay? Here's how they reported the interview. One of them says, just a trace of a smile about his lips. Another one says, very serious and grim. Another one says, he did not smile. Another one says, he sat looking up at them. Another one says, he was standing at his low mahogany desk. Another one says simply, he was standing.
Oh, wow.
Well, was he standing or was he sitting? Did he smile or was he serious and grim? Depends on which report you read. Professional observers, primed to pay particular attention going into one situation like this, vary in those details. Maybe he was sitting and then he stood up. Maybe he grinned a little bit at one guy and not at another one. I don't know. But those are the actual variations that we have. The New York Telegram ran a story in August of 1927 where they were amused at all the variations in these accounts, and so they tabulated them for you. So if you look at the August 4th, 1927 copy of the New York Telegram, you can find all of these variations tabulated for you. This is normal with eyewitness testimony. And Ehrman depends upon our falling for the idea that no, there are no such variations in honest testimony, surely not. He depends upon our forming this false idea of what eyewitness testimony is like in order to then try to say, oh, see, so these accounts of Paul's conversion, well, we just can't trust that. This must be Luke writing a tall tale, trying to write a striking story, not really caring about the details. Well, that's just crazy. He's not calibrating that against what we know from secular history about careful reporters trying to be truthful, immediately writing about what they just then themselves observed.
So essentially what you have here, and correct me if I'm wrong, is on one hand you have these different or supposedly different accounts in Acts, but in translating the words there in Greek, it's not really a problem, as opposed to this American history of a president in 1927 where you have 4 different accounts that are clearly all not the same. And so that when you look at Acts, you can reconcile those accounts because of the way in which the word is translated, whereas over here, it's clear he can't both be standing and sitting at the same time.
Right. And so, we have an easy, straightforward way of understanding what we're reading in Acts in the various accounts of Paul's conversion as straightforwardly truthful. We can't even think of an obvious way to do that in the case of Calvin Coolidge and the announcement, without having to resort to things that are clearly not in any of the reports, like he was sitting and then stood up, or he was standing up when they came in and then he sat down. We don't know.
Yeah.
We just have to conjecture that if we want to reconcile them.
So to reconcile Coolidge, you pretty much have to come up with something that's ad hoc to make it all fit together.
It might even be true, but if you do, it's certainly something that's not stated in any of the accounts. But so what? I mean, the headline remains: Calvin Coolidge declines to run for office in a second term, right?
Yeah, no doubt.
That's all.
Okay, so let's transition to the last question. I'll toss you a softer softball than what I have here recently. So let's say you have somebody out there that's listening right now and says, "Man, this is really interesting. This is really cool. I want to know more about the reliability of Acts and the writings of Paul." Where would they start? Because maybe somebody that's out there, doesn't have the time or money to go out and get a master's degree in apologetics or master's degree in New Testament. Where can the layman go, or what can the layman do to really start digging into the reliability of Acts and the writings of Paul?
I would recommend that you get something both on the internal evidence and on the external evidence. So on the internal evidence, I would focus first on the undesigned coincidences, because I think that's just a wonderful trove of information. The best modern book on that subject is the one written by my wife, Lydia McGrew. It's called Hidden in Plain View: Undesigned Coincidences in the Gospels and Acts. The section on Acts goes through quite a number of these undesigned coincidences between the book of Acts and the Pauline letters, and I think that would be an excellent starting place for somebody who wants to dig into that material. There's an older book that also has a lot of good information, and Lydia used it as a basis as she was writing her own, and that's by William Paley, who's more famous, I guess, for his watchmaker argument, his design argument, but he wrote a book called Horae Paulinae, The Times of Paul. Don't worry, the book is not written in Latin, just the title. But that came out in 1790, and it's a detailed comparison of the Pauline epistles with the book of Acts and with one another, and it is all about the argument from undesigned coincidences. So for the internal evidence, I would go there. For the external evidence, if you just want to start getting a feel for it, I would recommend a book by Jefferson White, published in 2001, called Evidence and Paul's Journeys. It's a meticulously documented, but it's not overwhelming, and it pulls together a lot of material in a very clear format. It's a good place to start your study. If you have read White and then you want to go deeper, the next place that I would go is Colin Hemer's book, The Book of Acts in the Setting of Hellenistic History. That's one volume, 1989. He was a British classicist who did a fantastic job amassing historical evidence regarding the Book of Acts. I rarely disagree with Hemer, or just occasionally there are some points where I might differ from him, but I think he's done a really superb job, still accessible to somebody who's not a super scholar. And I would say that Hemer's book is your next place to go if you're looking for a lot of detail on the Book of Acts. And it's just a wonderful piece of work.
Awesome. So, as we wrap up the podcast here, just want to, give you the opportunity to let the audience know about any projects that you're working on, any debates coming up, or anything you've got going on as far as professionally in the realm of philosophy or apologetics.
Yeah, so the immediate thing that's coming up is that I'll be speaking at a conference in Germany in 2 weeks. I will actually be over in Munich giving a talk on miracles for a international conference there with, it's not a Christian conference, it's not an apologetics conference, but I expect a lot of really interesting technical work to be going down there, and so that's going to be fun for me. And I'm prepping for that even as we speak. In fact, before we logged on to do this podcast, I was writing out my talk for Germany.
Outstanding. Well, Dr. McGrew, thank you so much for coming on the show. It is a an honor and a privilege, and I'm thankful for your time. To the audience, thank you so much for tuning in. And remember, as you leave, equip yourself to engage culture. Have a great day, and God bless.